I never thought I'd be sitting here, stripped of my license, writing about the very thing I spent years helping others avoid. 15 years as a marriage counselor, hundreds of couples guided through their darkest moments, and yet here I am, the cautionary tale taught in ethics classes. It started like any other referral. Sarah and Michael Bennett, another couple struggling with communication and trust issues. Sarah, a high-powered corporate attorney, contacted me first. Their initial paperwork indicated the usual suspects: growing apart, work stress, lack of intimacy, nothing I hadn't seen thousands of times before. The first session was textbook. Sarah did most of the talking, while Michael sat there, calm and attentive, occasionally nodding or offering brief responses. I remember thinking how composed he seemed compared to most husbands in their first session. Most men either shut down completely or become defensive, but Michael engaged thoughtfully, his green eyes reflecting both intelligence and pain. I should have recognized the warning signs during our third session. The way my heart rate slightly increased when Michael arrived early. How I found myself hoping Sarah would be delayed at work, giving us those precious few minutes of conversation before the session began. His subtle observations about life, his gentle self-deprecating humor, they began to fill my thoughts outside of our professional interactions. My colleagues would later ask how I could have let this happen. The ethical guidelines were clear, the boundaries well-defined. But emotions don't follow professional protocols. They seep through the cracks of our carefully constructed walls, drop by drop, until suddenly you're drowning. It wasn't just physical attraction. I'd dealt with that before with other clients. This was different. During sessions, I found myself increasingly drawn to Michael's perspective, subtly siding with his viewpoints. When Sarah would complain about his emotional unavailability, I'd find myself thinking, but he's trying so hard. I began to notice things about their dynamic that irritated me. How Sarah would check her phone during sessions, how she'd dismiss Michael's attempts at vulnerability with casual sarcasm. The turning point came during a particularly intense session. Sarah had discovered some emotional texts between Michael and a female colleague. Nothing explicitly inappropriate, but enough to trigger her trust issues. As Sarah unleashed her anger, I watched Michael shrink into himself, his usual composure cracking. Without thinking, I intervened more forcefully than necessary, challenging Sarah's reaction in a way that crossed the line from therapeutic to personal. After the session, Michael stayed behind, ostensibly to schedule their next appointment. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for seeing me, not us." The air in my office felt electric. We stood there, the silence between us heavy with unspoken words. I should have stepped back, referred them to another counselor, done anything except what I did next, meet his gaze and hold it for far too long. The next few weeks became an exercise in self-deception. I told myself I was being professional, that I could handle these feelings, that I was still serving their best interests. But my notes after each session became increasingly focused on Michael's progress, his insights, his pain. Sarah became a secondary character in my documentation, just as she was becoming a secondary character in my thoughts. We never crossed any physical boundaries during their therapy. But emotional infidelity doesn't need touch to flourish. It lives in lingering glances, in empathy that runs too deep, in the mental elaboration of what-if scenarios. I found myself looking forward to their sessions with an intensity that should have been my final warning sign. The ethical crisis peaked during a session where Sarah proudly announced a potential job opportunity in another city. Michael's face fell, and in that moment, I felt physical pain on his behalf. My reaction must have shown because Sarah paused mid-sentence, looking between us with sudden clarity. She canceled their next session. A week later, I received a formal complaint to the licensing board. Sarah had meticulously documented every instance where my therapeutic neutrality had wavered, every moment where my empathy had tipped too far toward her husband. Reading through her compilation, I couldn't deny the pattern. The professional distance I'd prided myself on maintaining throughout my career had eroded so gradually I hadn't noticed its disappearance. The investigation was thorough and humiliating. My case notes were scrutinized, my methodology questioned. Other clients were interviewed. While no evidence of physical impropriety was found, the emotional breach of ethics was clear. I surrendered my license before they could revoke it, hoping to preserve some small measure of dignity. Michael and Sarah moved away, their marriage presumably either strengthened or destroyed by my failure to maintain professional boundaries. I never found out which, and I realize now that I lost my right to know when I allowed my personal feelings to contaminate their therapeutic space. The aftermath has been a journey through shame, self-recrimination, and eventually, understanding. The power dynamics in therapy are complex. Clients come to us vulnerable, seeking guidance through their darkest moments. That trust is sacred, and I violated it not through any overt action, but through the subtle redirection of my emotional energy toward my own needs rather than their healing. My colleagues stopped calling. Professional friendships withered under the weight of my transgression. The therapeutic community is small, and news travels fast. Some defended me, pointing to my previously spotless record, but most maintained a professional distance that spoke volumes about how thoroughly I'd betrayed our shared ethical foundations. The irony doesn't escape me, that I, who had helped so many couples navigate the treacherous waters of emotional affairs, fell victim to one myself. The very behaviors I'd warned clients about became my own. The rationalization, the minimization, the slow erosion of boundaries. I'd known all the warning signs but convinced myself they didn't apply to me. Now, months later, I've begun to understand that this wasn't just about Michael. It was about my own unmet needs, my own vulnerabilities. The emotional isolation of being everyone's confidant but having no one to confide in. The vicarious attraction to clients' stories of passion and pain. The dangerous belief that my professional training made me immune to human weakness. I've started counseling of my own, a necessary step in processing this professional suicide. My therapist helps me explore the patterns that led to this collapse of boundaries. We talk about the godlike role therapists sometimes assume, the intoxicating power of being needed, the way empathy can blur into attraction when we're not vigilant. The hardest part isn't the loss of my practice or professional standing. It's the knowledge that I compromised the therapeutic journey of a couple who came to me for help. Whatever issues Sarah and Michael were grappling with became secondary to my own emotional drama. I failed them not through any dramatic breach of ethics, but through the slow poison of divided loyalties. Some days, I catch myself wondering about Michael, where he is, if he ever thinks about those sessions, if he knew the impact he had on my professional judgment, but I stop myself quickly. Those thoughts are part of the problem, not the solution. My role in their story should have remained that of a guide, not a participant. The field of marriage counseling will continue without me. Other therapists will guide couples through their struggles, maintaining the professional distance I failed to preserve. Perhaps my story will serve as a warning in ethics seminars, a reminder that no amount of training or experience makes us immune to human feelings. I've learned that the boundaries we maintain as therapists aren't just professional requirements. They're essential safeguards for both client and counselor. When we let them erode, we don't just risk our licenses. We risk the very healing we're supposed to facilitate. Sometimes, late at night, I revisit the moment I should have referred them to another counselor. It was early in their treatment, when I first noticed my pulse quickening at Michael's arrival. One different decision then, and my career would still be intact, their therapy uncompromised by my emotional entanglement. But we can't rewrite our stories, only learn from them. I'm sharing this not to justify my actions or seek sympathy, but as a testimony to the complexity of human relationships and the sacred trust we place in those who guide us through our darkest moments. The title of marriage counselor may be gone from my name, but the lessons of this experience will stay with me forever. A reminder that the heart's decisions can undo years of professional judgment in the space of a single unguarded moment.